security or private security, and I focused, I had the opportunity to design and integrate into the university-wide curriculum 2 courses on these issues, and I focused primarily on corporate security matters. At that time, again, in the early to mid-1980s, much of the corporate security curriculum, certainly throughout the United States, if not 99.9% of it, was directed toward the safeguarding or protection, if you will, at that time, of physical or tangible assets belonging to a corporation. And shortly after I designed and integrated those courses, I had the good fortune of, as everyone on this on the line today, all the attendees and participants can share, I had the good fortune of reviewing research, which was very much part of my daily regimen, as it is with yours, and I came across some work at that time, some very early work. I believe it was the initial work conducted by the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., and they had a project called the Intangibles Project. And I read the project notes very, very carefully and vigorously, and felt very strongly that it literally hit me at the time that this is where the security industry, the security profession, the security discipline should move into. And because there were increasing amounts of value in corporations that were evolving directly from intangible, non-physical assets versus the conventional physical or tangible assets. And again, I felt very strongly about that, so much so that the following week that I read that report, I got on the plane and flew to Washington to meet with the principal investigators of that report at Brookings, and acquired some insight, and I've been hooked, if you will, ever since that time on pursuing most all matters related to intangible assets, and worked very hard to, I accept it, and I say this in a most humble and respectful sort of way, but I accept a mission, if you will, in life to change the security profession and discipline to looking harder and harder at safeguarding intangible assets on behalf of their client or their corporation versus the conventional physical or tangible assets. That's not to say that tangible assets are going to go away, removed from the map altogether, but companies too are becoming more alert to the reality that 80+%, I use that figure myself, 80+% of a company's value today, their sources of revenue, and what I refer to, if you would accept, please, a kind of what I refer to as a Morberlyism. Their building blocks for growth, sustainability, and profitability either evolve directly from or directly related or lie in, if you will, intangible assets, not physical or tangible assets, and that is kind of a lead-in. There was, in terms of further introduction, if you may, if I may, just to give you another insight respectfully, that how I became further engaged in the intangible asset arena. And that was, this event occurred several years ago when I had the good fortune of having a very productive, very insightful conversation with a individual who was very highly placed in at that time, a developing country's agricultural ministry. And the timing of that conversation was interesting in itself, in that there were one company in particular, in which where I'm sitting now in St. Louis, I'm only approximately 2 miles from its world headquarters, that was heavily engaged in what I call GMO'd IP, genetically modified organisms, and characterizing it in an intellectual property context. And my conversation with this agricultural ministry gentleman went something like this. And he said to me, "Mike, you have something I want, and I'm going to get it." And he said that in a very matter-of-fact sort of way, without eyes twitching or eyes or lips twitching whatsoever. And I felt he was very, very serious about that. Again, you have something I want, and I'm going to get it. And then he went on to say, if I get that, let me rephrase that. He said, when I get that, again, reference to this GMO'd IP, I can mitigate hunger and starvation and thereby save thousands of lives in my country merely by allowing crops to be able to grow in that country in what is now agriculturally unproductive land, and literally change that land into high-yield food production areas. Again, of course, he was referring to what I call the GMO'd IP, and he had no interest whatsoever in paying the premium price points that this particular company was asking, nor did he intend to adhere to the contractual obligations related to acquiring and utilizing that GMO'd IP. Those two events in themselves made a very strong impression upon me to continue to pursue intangible assets as an entity and as something that was literally changing global business practices. So as you can see on the PowerPoint, okay, let's see here.
So we set that convention. Why you set that?
What I call starting perspectives of any conversation that I have with be it business or a group I'm speaking to, and this group obviously is probably in many respects far ahead of me in many aspects of this, but nevertheless it is a economic fact, what I call a business reality, that higher and higher percentages of most companies' value, their sources of revenue, building blocks, etc., evolve directly from or lie in intangible assets. Now, the point here is I try very hard not to generalize intangible assets, in that my focus on intangible assets, in which you'll see later in the slides, there are primarily, we consider 15 categories of intangible assets, and that evolves from a colleague of mine on the West Coast, Weston Anson. But I extend that to about 17 categories, and I focus primarily on where my interests lie are in intellectual capital, structural capital, and relationship capital. So that's my primary focus. And an interesting point that I also make, and I offer these just in terms of not only continuing my research, on a daily basis like everyone online, but in my meetings, and just as in this morning, earlier this morning, for example. Unlike conventional IP, governments do not issue a certificate or come around and tell you what your intangible assets are. And my point for saying that, it is sometimes challenging, unfortunately, still challenging for even the most savvy a business person and most successful business person, regardless of where they may reside in the globe, to understand that notion, understand what intangible assets are, coupled with the fact that we live and work in a business transaction environment that is extraordinarily predatory, and what I say, instantaneously competitive, and oftentimes, unfortunately, winner-take-all types of transaction environments, which I will address here a little later and explain. Predatorial simply means, as the term you would think of the term, that there are countless entities operating throughout the globe, as many of you know, in which their sole purpose is to acquire other companies' intangible assets, that being, again, their intellectual capital, their structural capital, their relationship capital, in terms of what makes that company particularly competitive in the market space, and then ultimately use or apply that information to their own benefit. I never mention countries because, or particular entities engaged in these activities. I think it's fairly, in my judgment, and I say this somewhat respectfully, I think it's a rather useless endeavor. We know who some of those individuals are, but there are also growing numbers on a daily basis. A side point to that is that in one of Thomas Friedman's, he is a feature writer for the New York Times. He wrote in one of his earlier books, The Flat World, or The World is Flat, and he talked about a group in which he referred to as legacy-free players. By that he means, and I corresponded with Mr. Freeman on this to make sure that I was on the same page as his thinking. If we think of it in this context, ladies and gentlemen, we are only globally speaking, with the exception of a few countries, those primarily in the West, we are only in today what I refer to as the first and one-half generation of having the wherewithal economically and the legal standing to purchase private property, let alone intellectual property, and hold intellectual property. That in itself is a phenomenon that is still going to take some years to fully work out and even out, if you will. The fourth point that I routinely make with businesses, as well as any conversation I have, is that as Roy alluded to in her introduction, that intangible assets still often go unrecognized, certainly underutilized, and certainly unsafeguarded or unprotected, because largely they lack physicality. And I'm often confronted with that notion in particular with companies, in that you're protecting the invisibles, as I heard on some trips to the UK and Europe in general. Secondly, intangible assets often fall under conventional MBA radar in an educational context. So students come out of either business programs or MBA programs or B schools in general, certainly here in the West, without a comprehensive understanding of the role or definition or what constitutes intangible assets. And then finally, as I've read in many of your papers, people on the line today, as certainly as Ray is, and that is seldom, if ever, intangible assets are ever reported on balance sheets or financial statements. So therefore, using a quote from Ray many years ago, it does not lend well to gaining a comprehensive picture of a company's real wealth. So the second point I wish to make on slide 3 is conventional forms of IP. And as perhaps some of you can assume or presume from my conversation thus far, in some respects I'm not a great fan of intellectual property per se, that is patents. And my rationale is that that embedded in a patent are intellectual structural capital in particular. And that is what holds the value in my judgment. That is where the value lies. And hence that is what I think it's most prudent for institutions, for countries, for companies, for organizations to devote their safeguarding resources and efforts to safeguard. No longer does IP constitute a deterrent, and as to would-be infringers or misappropriators or product piracy, etc. I think that that notion of deterrence has been, that boat has long sailed. And I say deterrence in the context of ENTS or ENCE. It is largely absent. People today, and I'm referring to a number of studies, one by Perserec and others about insiders and things of that nature, that people are just people, that being employees, insiders, etc., are less inclined to be concerned or be deterred by the mere fact that a patent has been issued. Secondly, IP in general, as it used to, no longer is a consistent representation or indicator of a company or a project within that company's real value. And I've done quite a bit of what I find personally very interesting work in that area of research, and in which I, for lack of a better word, followed conversations within a company, and how conversations in a company oftentimes elevate the value of a particular initiative, because when two people converse, oftentimes they come up with a consensus or perhaps a better idea or a more efficient process, something of that nature. And so that's a very poor description of what I did, but nevertheless, I think perhaps, I'm sure you kind of get the message. And then IP always requires additional asset safeguards beyond merely assuming that there is some deterrent level. On page 4 and page 5 are just some that I oftentimes include in conversations, certainly not in, and perhaps I should have left these out with a group of this this level of distinction, but I elected to leave them in this presentation because in many instances I find, be it a Fortune 100 company C-suite or a SME C-suite, or a mid-sized mature company C-suite, they still, I find, and I say it respectfully, challenge, a certain level of challenge in terms of understanding what intangible assets and competitive advantages that evolve from those intangible assets really are. And I have a couple of quotes from Porter and of course McKinsey, and then I developed my own on page 5, which is kind of a conglomeration. But then lastly on page 5 is a definition by Brookings. On page 6 you see intangible asset examples, and as I noted earlier, there are generally agreed upon about 15 categories of intangible assets. I have just personally stretched that to about 17 categories of intangible assets, which if you would like to see that, I'd be more than happy to forward that at some point if you wish and see what it does. But I have just done an awful lot with these categories, and let me cite an example of real estate in particular. And I worked let me start this little piece of discussion, and I won't belabor the point, but I see intangible assets every place, so probably not unlike most of you online today. I see intangible assets embedded in so many different things that we all do. I worked very diligently for about 2 years trying to get security product manufacturers and dealers to understand that part of their selling initiative should include a reference on behalf of the prospective client to the intangible assets that those products bring to a particular environment. The intangible aspects being once we install the security mechanism, the security product, it'll present a more safe and secure environment. Therefore, presumably, employees will be able to work more consciously and absent any fear of intrusion, et cetera, all those types of things. That was as many of my initiatives with intangible assets, again, because they're invisible, because they're intangible, because they're just sometimes challenging to fully grasp, as it was for these individuals. On page 7, I asked, why shouldn't intangible assets be on management teams' radar screens? And the answer to that is very involved in many different variables involved in that. But I've selected a couple here. One is time frames, or what I refer to as windows or shrinking. And again, I say that in the context that we work in a very highly compressed and increasingly compressed business transaction environment in which deals are constructed daily, hourly, by the minute sometimes. And so we have shrinking time frames or windows when the most value can be extracted from those intangible assets, that being, again, primarily the intellectual and relationship capital and structural capital that's involved. A second part of that is the ease and literally sometimes barrier-free speed which global competitive advantage adversaries, again, kind of a Morberlyism there, global intangible or competitive advantage adversaries can enter any global market, and I often say, and it's a truism in every sense of the word. Competition is very asymmetric today. It can come from anywhere, anytime, any place, in any product or industry sector. A second factor that kind of compresses the time frames when the most value can be achieved from intangibles is due to a very prolific and sophisticated group of global insiders, infringers, and counterfeiters, of course. And that imposes some additional responsibilities on us for that. A third point is the fragility of asset value. Intangible asset value oftentimes is quite fragile. Once an asset, intangible asset in particular, becomes compromised, what I call, another Morberly is economic competitive advantage hemorrhaging, not may but will commence very rapidly and globally. And in my work and study and research in this arena, pretty much on a global basis in my travels, it has become not merely a probability, rather an inevitability that this will occur. And then I talk about the globally predatorial networks of legacy-free players, which I referred to earlier as a takeoff from Tom Friedman's book, in which he described legacy-free players. But highly sophisticated data mining and business competitive intelligence operations that literally, in what I call, in a very short time frame, again, that window can undermine or erode an asset's value very, very rapidly, and therefore its competitiveness. And then it's necessary, as I point out here, that how intangible asset risks, I am not a proponent of the word threats, but I put it in there, risks materialize, and be it reputational risk or otherwise, and can adversely affect very rapidly asset value by undermining competitive advantages, by undermining new product launches, new product launches, undermining a company's strategic planning that they have engaged in. It can also create adverse cascading effects that literally cascade throughout an enterprise, throughout a company. And no longer are we at a point, in my judgment, of containing a lot of that materialized risk because of the extraordinary communication systems that are so readily available today, social media, etc. And lastly, and unfortunately, when asset risks materialize, they can, what I call, ensnare and entangle. Again, pardon me, another Morberlyism. Intangible assets, ensnare and entangle intangible assets, and additional costly, time-consuming, momentum-stifling legal disputes and challenges. When those things come together, they certainly have an adverse effect on value and competitiveness. So moving on to slide 8, kind of roadmap directions or destinations where we want to be. And this is what I've worked on for the last, like many of you online, I'm sure, for many years. In my case, 25 plus years. And that is business decision makers, management teams, C-suites, etc., must recognize and use a broader range of options that are quickly becoming fiduciary responsibilities. Here in the United States, we had a court case a few years ago coming out of the state of Delaware called Stone v. Ritter, which come very, very close to imposing a fiduciary responsibility on company boards to know more of what's going on inside the company in which they sit on its board, particularly its intangible assets, which is quite interesting. Speaking of that, I had the very distinct pleasure and honor of being invited 2 years ago to a program at Georgetown University on intangible assets, and a group of individuals, maybe 100 on a global basis, came and conversed and just had an extraordinary time of learning and conversing with one another and learning what was transpiring in other countries, again, on a global basis. One of the most interesting points, one might say, and I think I do, was our keynote speaker on the very first morning, who was Ben Bernanke, who at the time was chairman of the Federal Reserve. And I call it in my writing the first time in the history of a Federal Reserve chairman that used the word intellectual property and intangible assets in the same sentence in the first or second paragraph of his presentation. So that led all of us in the audience to say, hey, we're really on the road to going places. So, but to continuing on with this slide on page 8, management teams contribute, and they must start contributing. They must engage, what I call engage their intangible assets in terms of what I call stewardship, oversight, and management, helping position their company's intangibles by unraveling the origins of those intangibles, the content of that intellectual capital, and then continuing to look for ways to monetize or commercialize those intangible assets. And that has always presented some stumbling blocks and challenges, but there's a tremendous amount of good research in this arena that I'm sure many of you are perhaps more familiar than I, and that is a group out of DC called the Athena Alliance, and has produced some excellent work on intangible asset monetization. Slide 9, the last slide, management team responsibilities and contributions. First of all, again, to kind of summarize, understand what intangible assets are. And if you are challenged by understanding what they are, or, and I say this not so respectfully, that if you are inclined to merely be dismissive of your company's intangible assets and the intangibles they produce, and I could go on with countless experiences I've had in companies in which that in fact has happened. They've been extraordinarily dismissive of intangible assets. That is by listening to their IP counsel or their accountant, who neither of which, in my judgment, seems to convey or demonstrate much concern or care about a company's intangible. The second point on that page I wish to make is it's incumbent upon management teams to understand where their pockets, their chains, their clusters, their producer of intangible assets originate and are located. But more importantly, they must understand that the intangible assets, and I say this very euphemistically, not to be comedic, but they must understand that the intangible assets, they're not represented by a patent issuance that you can hang on a wall, if you will, that says you've been issued patent number 00056, whatever the case may be. You must recognize that the intangible assets are often embedded in products and services and processes, etc., through, again, intellectual, relationship, and structural capital. And if you don't grasp that notion, then you're in for a kind of a rough road. You need also to be able to achieve someone in your firm, preferably someone in the C-suite, has some capability and competency, and I say C-suite or a designee, to be able to unravel, what I call unravel, that's another Morberlyism, but unravel the intangible assets, being able to assess, not necessarily their value, but to assess what it is they are and monitor those key assets, origins, and contributory value. Now, contributory value is again, pardon me for saying this for far too many times, but a kind of a Morberlyism I dreamt up. I became quite frustrated with the conventional models for valuing IP in that, as you know perhaps better than I believe there are 5 conventional quantitative methods to value IP. I have nothing negative to argue about any of those, but I do find in my experience in many different venture forums and talking with many different countless VCs on a global basis that the valuations that they performed were oftentimes, in my judgment, snapshots in time, in that they did not take into consideration the fragility of the intangible assets, either their competitiveness or their value, and how readily those intangible assets can be undermined to the point of being rising at a value of literally zero, having no value. So in lieu of that, I came up with a process of unraveling, assessing intangible assets in terms of what is the contributory value of that piece of intellectual capital, structural capital, relationship capital to a company's revenue, to its value, etc., to serve as a building block for growth, sustainability, and profitability. And for me personally, it's a more efficient way, a more effective way, and it's not merely a snapshot in time to look at it, as is the stability, fragility, defensibility, and transferability of those assets. You take that all into consideration, market space, attractivity, etc. The next item that I wish to bring to your attention is management team contributions and their obligation to engage their company's intangible assets by recognizing, ladies and gentlemen, that intangible assets, in my judgment, and I think many of you online today would probably agree with this, are literally in play in most every transaction, product launch, etc. Because when you go back to that notion, that view that such significant percentages and rising percentages of companies' value evolves from or lies in intangible assets, it is, in my judgment, quite appropriate to and prudent to assume that intangible assets are going to be in play in most any business transaction. And then, as such, given the fragility and those other issues of intangible assets, it is most appropriate to conduct and engage in what I refer to as both a pre and post due diligence. Pre, before buy, and post, after buy. A due diligence of that. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, what you're buying, if you're buying IP and the intangible assets embedded in that IP, to make sure that what you're buying is what you get in 30 to 45 to 60 days after that transaction has been secured or consummated. And that's oftentimes a left out part of this process. Again, we must recognize, I believe it is in our interest to recognize that intangibles as well as IP are quite fragile. And then lastly is develop an intangible asset intelligent corporate culture. That is a mouthful to say the least, but is to work with a company to help them recognize, respect assets, contributory value by promoting what I call the 3 A's: awareness, alertness, and accountability. And there's a number of different ways that that can occur. So that concludes my presentation, and I would be more than happy and certainly welcome to receive questions. Let me conclude with this point. Every aspect of what I've addressed here in this very quick PowerPoint, there's much research that needs to be done in all aspects, and I generally enjoy engaging in research and identifying a research path, a research strategy to really get to the heart of this. A classic example, this past week I was in Atlanta I did a couple of presentations, one of which was on the economic costs of product piracy, and much to the chagrin of the audience, I very readily say, it was not a presentation about what is the best way to prevent X, Y, and Z from occurring, or X risk materializing with respect to mitigating or preventing a product piracy. Rather, what I did, and again, admittedly much to the chagrin of some of the audience or attendees, I looked at 2 studies, and 2 of my favorite studies that I think really address this issue in the most potent way and in the most objective manner. And that was one study that came out in 2013 by a group in Washington, D.C., the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who collaborated with McAfee and under the guidance of Dr. Jim Lewis, who was a director of those issues at CSIS. A second study that I looked very long and hard at, and that turned out to be an excellent study, was a study that was initiated by a firm in Roslyn, Virginia, called Centra Technologies, and they collaborated with the George Bush School of Business down at let me see, University in Texas. I'm embarrassed to say, right offhand, Texas Christian, I believe, University, and to do just a really fascinating study in that they looked at compromises and losses of IP by industry sector, and they felt, therefore, in both cases, both these studies, their findings, I felt, were much, much more objective as opposed to be agenda-driven for a variety of reasons, which I find most previous ones